Hey there, folks. The number one Jessica Pratt fan from the Infinite Jukebox, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Jessica Pratt record, Here in the Pitch. Singer, songwriter, performer, Jessica Pratt has been known to take a few years off in between album releases, album cycles, but I think I speak on behalf of the majority of her fanbase when I say that the wait has pretty much always been completely worth it, even besides just wanting to respect her decisions to take a step away from things when she wants to. It's also just, in my opinion, the fact that her studio albums are pretty consistently great. There's really no point where I've ever felt disappointed by her output in any way, really. And that's because despite never really achieving household name status like certain other singer-songwriters over the course of the past 15 years or so, Pratt has a distinctly transcendental style and aesthetic with a very easily distinguishable semi-shrill voice that marks her as one of the most unique folk-adjacent performers to come to relevance throughout the entirety of the 2010s. And now here we are with Here in the Pitch, the album that is, in a sense, meant to reintroduce Pratt to a 2020s audience, considering this is her first album in a full 5 years. After pretty much countless major world events happening since the last studio album we've gotten from Pratt, it goes without saying that I think the majority of her fanbase were expecting her to return at some point or another when she felt like it, with a good amount of poignancy, with a lot to say, and that is true for this record. That being said, this is an album that does falter in one major place, which I'll get to later in this review, but I digress. The majority of Here in the Pitch is a nice return from Jessica Pratt after a 5-year break from major releases that manages to recapture a lot of what makes her so special artistically in the first place, while also acting as a pretty unique record in the context of her catalog. As for the positives of the record, I think it kind of goes without saying that the most immediately striking aspect of the album is Pratt herself. She has this extremely delicate and kind of mesmerizing vocal delivery that allows every track here to feel moving in some way, with some songs like Get Your Head Out, The Last Year, which is the album closing track for this record, as well as Better Hate, one of the highlights on the album, having this kind of lighthearted bossa nova-esque swing to them that I think kind of manages to accentuate the beats of her vocal rhythms to result in something that feels equally catchy and chilling, which, while I'm not saying this to insult some of her prior records, I don't necessarily think I would have ever used catchy or really hook-based to describe any album that Pratt has put out in the past. And in that sense, among several others, I feel that this record is actually pretty unique coming from her. Similar things could be said about her songwriting, if I'm being completely honest, with her very unique and distinct brand of bittersweet lyricism being fully on display here for the most part, with there being a lot of quotable lines, moving passages in abundance here despite the short runtime, with bits like I Never Was What They Called Me in the Dark from Empires Never Know, another major highlight on the record in my opinion, or The Curses You Keep Won't Follow You Now from the album opener Life Is, another excellent track, being prime examples of Pratt being at her absolute best and most poetic lyrically, with this being some, in my opinion, of the best songwriting that we've ever really gotten from her to date. Now, in a sense, Here in the Pitch does feel like a fair bit of artistic evolution from Jessica Pratt, which is something I'll touch on as far as why in a moment, but I do think it's important to note that this does not change the quality of her style, and it doesn't even necessarily change the roots of her sound. She still is in that sort of realm of semi-psychedelic folk music, singer-songwriter music, whatever you would really want to consider her. I don't necessarily think there's a way to pigeonhole her exact style, but whatever you would personally have considered her previous records, those influences, those sounds are still here in abundance. It just so happens that they are being presented alongside some fairly new ideas. But if you are looking at some of the kind of new directions that she's going in here occasionally and end up being a bit concerned if the quality of her songwriting, the quality of her vocal performances from past albums will be going down any or fluctuating any. I can pretty much assure you they do not at all. If you enjoyed her work in those regards on previous records, you will most likely, I would think anyway, enjoy it here. Now, one could also arguably cite a sort of consistency in quality regarding the general atmosphere of her previous LPs to this one, but I feel like that would be ignoring the fact that Here in the Pitch feels like the slightest bit of reinvention of what Pratt has done in the past, and I feel like I'd be doing this record a disservice if I didn't point that out to an extent. While her style has always been pretty much intentionally sparse and even somewhat otherworldly in nature at times, this has mostly been achieved via these dreamy soundscapes accompanied by subtle vocal performances and instrumental performances. And comparatively speaking, Here in the Pitch is a pretty different take on those same subtleties, kind of achieving the same results through a different method, which is pretty much the definition of experimentation without completely leaving behind what made you such a captivating artist to so many people in the first place. I don't think it would be right to ever call any of her previous albums dense or anything like that, but at the same time, they did often feature looming atmospherics that created this slowly swirling beauty that was extremely easy to enjoy, to find yourself engaged with, the kind of atmosphere that would make you want to listen from an album from front to back every time you had the slightest desire to listen to it. And on Here in the Pitch, a similar effect is created through a much more personable lens, and the album is primarily focused on Pratt's vocals, which feel maybe half a room away from the listener throughout the majority of the record, almost like it's a reasonably intimate one-on-one performance between her and those listening. It makes for a pretty interesting and at times even somewhat emotionally intense listening experience that I do to an extent expect from her body of work at this point, just not exactly in the way it's presented here. And I kind of think that the exploration of style and sound and the general variety that's being provided to her discography via this record is really nice to see. And that's all ultimately because the record is primarily focused on two things: Pratt's vocals and the instrumentation, the very low-key, subtle instrumentation provided by her, as well as mixing and mastering engineer Al Carlson, both of whom provide roles as instrumentalists throughout the entirety of this record. And you see on a variety of tracks here how the idea of limiting oneself in terms of tools at your disposal can ultimately breed a sort of minimalistic artistic beauty that I really do think is reflected in the majority of the tracks here at various moments. Empires Never Know is a pretty perfect example of this. You get this very one-on-one feel with Pratt's vocal performance, while at the same time you have Carlson sort of in the background on keys, adding a dramatic flair to things, if you will. And the following track, the instrumental Glances, is another wonderful reflection of this, as it primarily focuses on Pratt's guitar work, as well as a pretty soothing, very, very low-key mellotron in the background, ultimately resulting in something that feels like much more than just a brief instrumental interlude on an already fairly brief record. And all of this is happening while at the same time the majority of the neo-psychedelic influences that have defined some of Pratt's most beloved records in the past is still here in full force for the most part. Sure, you could argue that they have been pushed to the side in some moments for some more minimalistic or stripped back passages, but for the most part, this album does not feel like a total different record or style from some of her past records. And that's not me trying to say that I would have preferred more experimentation. In fact, I actually think it's better off this way. I think that this record does a great job expanding upon some of the prior sounds that she has become known for at this point, while also making a serious stake in forming its own identity, something it does successfully throughout its runtime. Because at the end of the day, Here in the Pitch manages to provide the same overall tone, overall vibe that some of her past releases have, but that tone, that vibe that I mentioned, is an interesting retelling of the sort of soundscapes that she's become known for over the past 10 plus years. It's this record that is wholly unique, yet at the same time distinctly Jessica Pratt's. The only thing that I would say truly drags here in the pitch down is something that has, for better or for worse, directly become entwined with a lot of Pratt's work up to this point and a lot of her past releases, which is that her latest studio album, I would argue, is maybe just a bit too short for its own good, or at least is a bit too short for me. I mean, hey, it isn't hard to appreciate a well-made, brief album that doesn't waste any time with filler, but I still can't help but feel like maybe this is a record that would have been just a little bit stronger if it had a touch more meat on its bones, just another track or two, because I'm not saying that this is an album that needed some sort of major stylistic shift halfway through its album track list. I don't think we needed some random Mr. Bungle feature to pop in here and just completely switch things up to free jazz or anything like that. I just mean that I think maybe a couple tracks more would have done some good, because I do think that the fairly singular sound that you have throughout the entirety of this record is something that does ultimately add to the atmosphere of the album, and I think that quality about this record is great. I really love that quality of it, that this album feels like a single piece. As stupid as that sounds, I love how every single track here bleeds together into the next, and it comes together to create this one singular whole that feels pretty essential in terms of hearing it from front to back if you do want to listen to it. I just wish that said whole was just a bit longer. I just mean to say that it would have been nice to have heard this expanded upon beyond what we have here, its final runtime of 27-ish minutes, and there's part of me that doesn't even want to bring up this complaint, if you can even really call it a complaint, because her past records, again, have been structured similarly, and while records like On Your Own Love Again do feature a comparably brief runtime, I do think that Here in the Pitch does somewhat, to an extent, reflect a bit of artistic growth for Pratt in the present day, also acting as a sort of reintroduction to potentially a new audience, as it is, again, her first album of the present decade. And as such, I just think a deeper track list would have been very much welcome, even if its present form does ensure that it doesn't overstay its welcome or take a dip in quality at any point. But even then, I think I would have liked that risk to have been taken for the sake of this album just feeling a little beefier at times. Jessica Pratt's first full-length studio album of the 2020s does fall in line with a lot of her past output, yet it does manage to distinguish itself as something that is a unique take on some of the melancholic singer-songwriter tendencies that she's been working with for well over a decade at this point. The record does kind of suffer from an overly brief runtime, and that's something that does leave the listener wanting more, or at least it leaves me wanting more, in a way that I feel is more a point against Here in the Pitch rather than a point for it, but at the same time, wanting more from an album is still better than wishing that there was less, so I guess things could be much, much worse. At the end of the day, Here in the Pitch is a nice return from a beloved singer-songwriter that manages to maintain some of the best qualities of her past work, while nonetheless managing to feel individualistic within the context of her own discography, which I think is somewhat surprising, but is very, very nice to see. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. So with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I will see you in the next one.